The summer of 1941 felt endless, warm, and strangely innocent. I remember standing at the edge of a wheat field in Ukraine, the stalks brushing against my palms as the wind rolled through them like a slow golden tide. The tractors rattled along the distant road, their engines coughing in the familiar rhythm of the season. Children kicked a ragged ball down a dusty lane, shouting at one another with the careless joy that only peacetime can give. Even in Belarus, where I had traveled weeks earlier, life clung stubbornly to its routines. Grain unloaded at tiny stations, guards lazily checking cargo manifests, old men playing cards in the shade of the freight office. Rumors of war floated around us like distant thunder, too faint to matter. Yes, we heard about German troops massing far to the west, but the railway lines hummed steadily every morning, and the sun rose with such quiet confidence that it seemed to promise nothing would change. People whispered, but they did not hide. Soldiers drilled, but their boots left only neat patterns in the dust, not fear. And yet, from time to time, I'd catch sight of something that didn't fit. A faint line of churned earth at the horizon, a ribbon of crushed soil stretching straight and merciless toward the east. Tracks, tank tracks. I told myself it was nothing, a training exercise, a misinterpreted trail left by some heavy farm machine. But the truth pressed harder with every passing day. Something vast was moving, silently, steadily, like a tide gathering far offshore. Standing alone on that field, I felt it before I understood it. The heat shimmered above the horizon, blurring the world's edges, and in that wavering haze I sensed that the fate of continents, of millions, was already rolling toward us, hidden behind the stillness of the summer air. By June, the truth could no longer hide behind the warmth of summer. News drifted in from the west like smoke from a distant fire. Poland crushed in weeks, France collapsing in a blur of tanks and sirens, the Balkans swallowed almost without a fight. Everywhere the same story, Germany advancing like a machine that did not understand the word halt. I listened to the radio in crowded canteens, men leaning closer each time the announcer's voice cracked. No one spoke afterward. We simply returned to our work as if silence might hold the world together a little longer. I felt the imbalance in every report I handled. German divisions numbered in the hundreds, their commanders confident, their Luftwaffe a storm front rolling ahead of them. They had marched from ocean to ocean without meeting an equal. Hitler boasted openly that the Soviet Union would fall in months, perhaps even weeks, and deep down many believed him. Blitzkrieg had become a kind of dark legend, fast, ruthless, unstoppable. And we, the Soviet Union, stood on the other side of that advancing shadow. The purges had hollowed out our ranks. Officers vanished overnight, replaced by men still learning how to wear their uniforms. Orders changed faster than supply trains could follow. I remember seeing raw recruits drilling with rifles older than their fathers, some wearing boots stuffed with newspaper because there were not enough proper replacements. We were supposed to be an empire of steel, yet at times we felt held together by fear and hope alone. Still, it wasn't simply weakness that haunted me, it was uncertainty. Everyone feared the same thing, from generals in Moscow to farmers in the villages: a long war. The Germans feared it because their lightning victories depended on speed. We feared it because we weren't ready for the first blow, let alone the 10th. And in that strange symmetry we were trapped, two giants stepping toward each other, each praying the fight would be short, knowing deep down it could not be. Looking back, I think the war had already begun in those weeks before the first shot. You could sense it in the hurried whispers at train stations, in the way officers scanned the horizon during their patrols, in the heaviness that settled over every conversation. We were moving toward something enormous, something neither side could escape, pulled forward by a knot tightening around both our throats. When I first saw the maps laid out across the operations table, they almost seemed elegant. Clean arrows, sharp lines, precise timetables. Operation Barbarossa looked less like a war plan and more like a blueprint for inevitability. 3 army groups cutting into our land like surgical blades. North toward Leningrad, center toward Moscow, south toward Kiev and the rich fields of Ukraine. German officers spoke as if the paths were already cleared, as if the Red Army would crumble the moment those arrows began to move. In those early days, even we felt the weight of their confidence. Reports poured in of entire cities folding in days, of airfields burning with rows of aircraft still neatly parked, caught asleep at dawn like sacrificial offerings. German armored columns advanced so swiftly that by the time we intercepted their radio chatter, their tanks were already kilometers ahead of where we thought they should be. I remember standing in a command post, listening to a stunned colonel whisper, "It's as if they're driving through air." For a brief moment, I feared they might be right, that their victory truly was inevitable. But then something strange began to happen. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but quietly, like a hairline crack spreading across glass. The beautifully drawn arrows on the map stopped matching the world outside. Roads the Germans expected to glide over dissolved into churned dust or sucked at their treads like wet clay. Our retreating units, scattered and bleeding, still managed to cut telegraph lines, blow rail bridges, or vanish into forests that seemed to swallow whole battalions. Their supply lines stretched thinner and thinner, snapping in places where partisans or simple distance chewed them apart. Ammunition arrived late, fuel sometimes not at all. And the land, endless, wide, indifferent, became an enemy they had not accounted for. I read one intercepted message from a German officer complaining, "The country expands the farther we drive." It wasn't sarcasm. It was fear. From my vantage point, watching the chaos unfold, I began to realize that the German plan, so perfect on paper, had collided with something it could not conquer: reality itself. The illusion of a quick, decisive victory, their cherished Blitzkrieg, began to crack, and through those cracks poured the first hints that the war ahead would be nothing like the one they imagined. By autumn, the war felt different beneath my boots. The ground that had been firm and dusty in June turned into a sucking, shifting swamp. Rasputitsa, the season I had once cursed only for ruining train schedules, became a living force that swallowed men whole. I watched German tanks, unstoppable in summer, sink into mud up to their hulls, their engines whining like trapped animals. Supply trucks stalled in endless columns, wheels spinning helplessly while soldiers pushed with shoulders hunched and faces streaked with filth. Progress, once measured in kilometers per hour, slowed to meters per day. The mud was only the beginning. When the cold arrived, it came like a verdict. One morning, I woke to see frost forming on my blanket as I breathed. Another week, the rivers hardened into mirrors of gray ice. Even the air felt sharp enough to cut. German reports we intercepted sounded almost confused, as if the weather itself had betrayed them. Weapons jammed the moment metal touched frozen fingers. Fuel thickened inside canisters. Engines froze, turning once proud tanks into silent, useless monuments scattered across white fields. I remember stumbling through a ruined village, hearing a German soldier banging desperately on the side of a stalled half-track, shouting at it as if the machine had simply chosen to disobey. Around him, others huddled over tiny fires, their breath clouding in the wind, their faces gaunt and cracked. They no longer marched for triumph. They marched because stopping meant dying where they stood. And we, tired, bleeding, freezing, felt the strain as deeply as they did. Each new phase of the campaign demanded more of us. More ammunition, more bodies, more endurance. Yet the returns dwindled. Counterattacks cost lives we could not count. Every report I wrote felt heavier than the last. The front lines stretched like some tortured wire, pulled thinner and thinner, threatening to snap. Still, the fighting did not stop. It shifted, twisted, reshaped itself, but never ceased. Snowstorms buried trenches overnight, only for artillery to uncover them again in thunderous bursts. Men disappeared into blizzards and returned as shadows. The land itself seemed determined to grind both armies down, to remind us that conquest here required more than courage or machinery. It required surviving the land's own merciless judgment. By winter's deepest cold, I sensed the Germans were no longer pushing toward their dream but away from their nightmare. And yet, neither side could pull back. The war had become a weight dragging all of us forward, step by frozen step, toward whatever end waited beyond the horizon. What struck me most that winter was not the thunder of artillery or the howl of the wind across frozen fields, it was the silence between them. A silence so deep it settled into your bones, the kind that made every man wonder whether he still existed. I spent nights crouched in half-collapsed shelters with soldiers who, only months earlier, boasted they would be home by Christmas. Now they warmed numb fingers over tin cans of weak broth, their faces hollow, their eyes dulled by hunger and sleepless weeks. Some wrote letters no one would ever read, folding them carefully into pockets that might soon be searched by strangers on a battlefield. I walked among German prisoners once, young men barely older than boys from my village. Their lips were cracked, their hands trembling as they held out bits of bread as if offering their last proof of being human. One whispered that his regiment had eaten frozen horse meat scraped with bayonets, another that he hadn't heard from home in 2 months. On our side it was hardly different. Our medics amputated frostbitten limbs with tools that froze to their gloves. I once saw a doctor heat a scalpel with a candle just to make a cut. The man on the table didn't even scream. He only stared at the ceiling as if somewhere above it lay a better world. The civilians suffered most. Villagers burned their own homes so the Germans would find nothing but ashes. Families packed what they could into sleds and fled into forests where wolves followed at a distance, drawn by the scent of misery. I remember helping an old woman dig through snow for potatoes she had buried months earlier. Her hands bled from the cold, yet she kept digging as if life depended on each handful of frozen earth. It did. Even the land seemed to mourn. Fields lay trampled and scarred, trees splintered by shells, rivers filled with debris and the remnants of bridges we had blown apart. At night, men shook uncontrollably, not from cold but from nerves stretched to breaking. I heard one soldier mutter in the dark, "Hunger is a wound you can't bandage." Another asked whether silence was worse than gunfire. Watching them, I understood that war was not only fought in offensives and retreats. It lived in the quiet tragedies carried by every soldier and every civilian on both sides. Private disasters hidden beneath layers of ice, mud, fear, and exhaustion. And those wounds I knew would outlast the winter. By December, all roads, mud, ice, or sheer will, seemed to lead toward Moscow. I reached the outskirts with a supply convoy just as the air turned sharp enough to bite through wool and felt. The Germans had pushed so close that frostbitten infantry claimed they could see the distant glow of the Kremlin on clear nights. Their officers spoke of one final effort, one last shove that would topple the heart of our country. But their machines betrayed them first. I passed entire lines of tanks frozen stiff, their engines dead, their metal so cold it sang when struck. Men wrapped in stolen carpets and horse blankets beat their fists against the armor, trying to wake the beast that had once carried them across half a continent. Our own situation was brutal, but something had shifted. Fresh divisions, many from Siberia, arrived like ghosts materializing from the snow. I watched them march past, faces hard, coats thick, rifles steady. They moved with the quiet confidence of men who had survived worse winters than this one. Rumors spread that they had been freed from guarding the eastern border after our spies learned Japan would not attack. Whether true or not, their presence felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning army. Then the counterattack began. I remember the moment clearly. Before dawn, the horizon cracked open with the thunder of our artillery, and Soviet troops surged forward into blinding snow. The Germans, already weakened, recoiled as if struck by a force they had never imagined possible. Their formations buckled, their lines frayed, and soon entire units withdrew in confusion, abandoning vehicles, guns, even wounded comrades in the white chaos. For the first time since June I saw Germans running, not regrouping, not maneuvering, but fleeing to survive the cold and our assault. Captured maps showed their advance halting just kilometers from Moscow, frozen in place like a photograph of an ambition that had died mid-step. The cost was staggering, thousands dead on both sides, fields littered with burnt-out armor, roads choked with bodies stiffening beneath frost. But the meaning was unmistakable. The Wehrmacht's myth of invincibility had shattered. Blitzkrieg, that terrifying whirlwind that had swept across Europe, had finally met something it could not break. When the front stabilized a few dozen kilometers west of the capital, we knew the truth. Moscow was saved, and the German dream of a quick victory lay buried beneath the snow. What remained was war in its most merciless form, a contest not of speed but endurance, where survival itself became the measure of victory. When the front finally settled and the echoes of the Moscow counteroffensive faded into the frozen forests, I felt as if the entire war had changed shape around me. The German advance, once a roaring avalanche, had slowed to a crawl, then to a halt, and finally to a trembling retreat. You could sense it in their intercepted messages, in the abandoned vehicles we passed on the roadside, in the hollow eyes of prisoners who no longer spoke of victory but only of surviving the next week. From that moment forward, the war became a grinding wheel, turning slowly, crushing everything caught beneath it. For Germany, the dream of a swift triumph died that winter. Their armies, stretched across 1,000 kilometers of hostile land, faced a war they were never built to fight. The cold became a symbol of their arrogance, a reminder that even the most precise plans could crumble before a single miscalculated season. I often thought of those long frozen columns of tanks, once invincible, now stiff and silent, standing like monuments to the danger of believing that ambition alone can bend reality. For us, the Soviet soldiers and civilians who endured that first terrible year, the victory near Moscow was less a triumph than a promise. That we could survive, that the land itself might shield us if we held on long enough. But survival came at a price. Entire villages vanished. Families froze in their own homes because fuel ran out. Fields that once fed millions were cratered wastelands. When spring finally came, it revealed not rebirth but the scars of a nation struggling to remember what peace even looked like. As the years passed, I returned to some of those places. I walked through forests where rusted helmets still lay half-buried beneath moss, and past memorial stones carved with names that ended abruptly in 1941. In cities, new monuments rose, Granite walls, eternal flames, bronze soldiers staring east or west as if guarding the past itself. People gathered there quietly, lighting candles, whispering prayers. Some brought photographs of men who had never come home. Others placed small toys for children lost in evacuations long forgotten by the world. I always felt that these gestures, fragile as they were, mattered more than any speech or parade. Even now, decades later, I cannot look at the first snows of winter without remembering that year, the hunger, the fear, the frozen silence before the counterattack. The memory is a weight I carry, not out of bitterness but out of warning. We learned then how quickly a continent can be thrown into fire by pride and certainty, how easily millions can be swept into a storm no one can control. Whenever I stand before a memorial or listen to survivors speak, I think of a line I once read, that the greatest enemy of peace is the belief that war is impossible. In 1941, too many believed exactly that. And so, as long as I live, I will remember the cost of that mistake, in the hope that those who come after us never repeat it.